for joining our webinar this morning. I'm Krista Ross, CEO at the Fredericton Chamber of Commerce, and we're really pleased to have a great turnout to learn about strategic planning today. We've all had our plans turned upside down in the last few weeks, so we've recognized the importance of planning and now looking at creating new plans. So I wanted to introduce Porter O'Brien. Tim Porter and Jordan O'Brien have a combined 50 years of experience in public relations, strategy, marketing, government relations, market research, and media training. That means they both started when they were about 14 years old, and now are 50 years in. I guess that means about 25 each. And they put a quote in the introduction to today's event that says, "A famous philosopher once said, 'Tactics without a plan are the noise before defeat.'" So today is a great opportunity to learn about how your organization or your company can benefit from a strategic plan. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over and invite them to start. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Krista. It's Tim here. I appreciate the opportunity to have this seminar today. We had a seminar a couple of weeks ago on media relations, and today we're going to run through strategic planning. We have a shortened version of a presentation that usually takes much more time, but we've kind of truncated it to 20 minutes or so, and we're going to run through a few slides, have a bit of a discussion, but save lots of time for the end so we can have a discussion and have questions and kind of enjoy ourselves over the next hour. So Jordan and I are a company in downtown Fredericton. Believe it or not, we do have an office that we occasionally collect the mail at these days. But we look forward to being back in business, as I'm sure a lot of you are, in the near future, and we're very optimistic about reopening later this spring and through the summer, and hopefully we won't have to do this again in the fall. It has certainly been a challenging time for everyone, and I appreciate the Fredericton Chamber at least keeping us connected in these times that are extremely difficult. So some of these seminars are good because it gives us a chance to kind of think about our organizations and where we're going, and it kind of gives us a time to pause and reconsider, I guess, whether we have the plans in place that we need to get us through the next few years. So Jordan and I have been working together. As I said, I have a background in media, in communications, and in intergovernmental affairs in Eastern Canada and in New England. And I recently formed a company with Jordan, and he has a background in government relations, public relations, and he's worked in government, and most recently he was a deputy minister to one of our premiers. So today's agenda, basically, we're going to run through the elements of a strategic plan, considering the who, what, where, when kind of questions. Look at some of the anchor statements for values and vision, mission. Talk a little bit about an environmental scan, setting goals, how to implement, and finally look at change management challenges. So I guess when you're beginning a strategic plan, you have to look at the time you want to consider it out for. Usually you want a medium type range for a strategic plan to run 3 to 5 years. Uh, uh, you don't want to be too short. You don't want to be too long. So 3 to 5 years is generally considered a good time frame for your plan. And you need to be able to link uh, your vision, your mission statement, your goals all together within the plan.
So in terms of who you would want to have involved in the planning of your plan, it's important to make sure that you have everybody that you need to have a clear line of sight into all the parts of your business. So usually that's your executive leadership team, but it can be different if you have some strong relationships with outside partners that are very involved in the delivery of your business objectives. You may want to involve them. This might particularly be the case with a small business. Maybe you do some e-commerce, but you outsource that to some other small local firm that is an expert in that sort of sphere. You would probably want to involve them if that's a big part of your business. You may, if you've got an ownership group and a board of directors that are independent of the day-to-day operations, you may want to involve some representation of them. Sometimes it's a bit of a newer trend. You'll have some representation of frontline workers as well if you're a bigger organization where the leadership team might not have a great line of sight into the day-to-day frontline customer-facing activities. But what's really important as you consider all that is it needs to be a manageable group. Once you get much bigger than 10 people, it's very difficult to do this kind of planning. And in fact, 10 is pushing it. You probably want a group closer to 5 to 7 people. And then not to be totally self-serving, but we would say you also need an experienced facilitator to help you through this. It's very difficult for somebody who's right in the middle of the business that owns a particular part of the business to come and facilitate a conversation in an unbiased way, even if it's a subconscious bias. So we would always suggest that you have somebody lead you through this process that knows how to lead structured dialogue, structured planning, pull ideas out of people with probing questions and not have a real stake in the outcome. When do you want to do this? There's a number of times, and I'm going to show you a few charts as we go through this section. But if you're new, that's obviously a time to plan. We would always recommend that a startup have a strategic plan in place before they begin their operations. When we talk about 3 to 5 years, Tim was talking about that before. I think 5 years is closer to the ideal, but a 3-year plan makes sense if you're brand new, because it's difficult to look that far into the future. And also if you're in a sphere where there's a lot of change, a lot of turn and turn, you may want a shorter strategic plan. But when you're new, you would want to do a plan. If there's something that's really materially changed that was unexpected, so you've changed your vision, your mission, or the environment in which you operate has changed. So for instance, you may have new ownership or new leadership who wants to take the enterprise in a slightly different direction. Maybe you're a not-for-profit that was focused very much on one particular group of society that you wanted to benefit, and now you're expanding to include others. That would be time to revisit your plan. A changed environment, no better example than COVID-19. A lot of us are reevaluating how we do business, and that might require you to kind of reinvent the wheel in terms of your plan. When you're going through change, a chart I like to talk to people about is this chart on the Valley of Despair. The y-axis over here says productivity, but that could be anything that your main business objective is. This might be customer satisfaction. It might be number of individuals you're able to help in society. It might be a variety of different measures. But when you're doing a strategic plan, the goal is growth. So you want to go from here further up here. Well, often you have what we call the Valley of Despair. When you introduce change is hard, and it takes people time to adapt, and that can be because people have new roles and responsibilities, they're learning them. It can be that maybe you've launched a new web portal to sell goods and it crashes, and that has a significant impact on on sales for a period of time. Could be a number of things. But you have to expect and plan for when you change that you're actually going to go in the wrong direction for a little while before the change is absorbed and accepted, and then you can start to move up in this upward trajectory. One of the things that you see here in this dotted red line that people will do, though, they have these big plans. Their goal is to be here. They're monitoring very closely, and they see that they're going in the wrong direction. They panic, and they undo the changes and go back to where they were. And that can result in you actually having this loss of productivity that's never regained, and your new normal is worse than where you were. So it's very important to make sure that you plan for and understand that there could be a loss of productivity in the short term. A really good plan will make sure that the depth of this is shallow and the width over time is narrow, so that it is a very quick downward tick, and then you're on the right path. And we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to the end of the presentation on change management. Another time that you might want to plan is declining success. So you've been doing very, very well. You're in maybe the second or third year of a 5-year plan, and all of a sudden you seem to have plateaued. It might be time to do an early reevaluation. Another chart. I love charts, and so for those of you that aren't a chart people, I apologize for putting you through these. There's only one more. But we talk about the SCurve in a business life cycle. So when you start off slow, you start to really get into your own. Maybe you've come through the valley of despair, and then you really start to take off. And eventually it flattens out at the top. And the idea in most businesses, they're growth oriented, and growth isn't necessarily about profit and customers. So you might be a not-for-profit, you might be a governmental organization, but you have something that you want to constantly be improving. So whatever this measurement is over here, you want to be on an upward path. When it starts to flatten out, it's because you've probably squeezed all the juice out of the plan that you have in place, and it's time to get a new plan. Every 3 to 5 years, as Tim mentioned, these plans do have an expiry date. And so you want to make sure that when one plan is expiring, there's a new one to replace it. So whenever if it's a 3-year plan, at 2 years and 9 months, you might want to start to plan to have something in place for when that ends. And then when people have time, and I put that in there somewhat cheekily because nobody thinks they have time. And nobody will ever have time if you just wait for people to have time. So you need to make sure that people have time. This is an important activity. It's not something that's going to happen regularly. It might be once every 5 years, but it will take a fair bit of time. It's probably about 2 full days of your executive team's time, not necessarily all in once. That might be broken into several half-day sessions, but you need to make sure people have the time. When I facilitate these, I bring a box and I collect people's phones to make sure that they're able to focus, and we structure in breaks so people can keep on top of their messages and so forth, or we'll suggest you do them on a weekend, but it's really important that people have the time to plan when you're planning and they're not distracted. All of these plans can really be boiled down to three statements, the big three we call them, which is a value statement, a vision statement, and a mission statement. These will be at the beginning of your plan, but they might not necessarily be all done first. You probably will do your value statement very early in the planning process. You may do your vision statement very early in the process, but the mission statement might come later. But in the end, that is the plan in a nutshell, is these 3 statements. They're very high level, 1 to 2 sentences, and a value statement lays out who you are, what your core belief system is, the reason why you exist, and what you want to accomplish in a very high level sense. The vision statement is very much tied to the plan. So if it's a 5-year plan, where do you want to be in 5 years? What's your objective? What would you see as different 5 years from now? And then your mission statement is how do you achieve that vision within the framework of your values? And that's the nutshell of a strategic plan. So in order to help you figure all that out, we go through an environmental scan exercise, which is basically, it's not the environment in terms of clean air and clean water, it's the environment in terms of the circumstances in which you operate. There's a variety of different environmental scanning tools. Most people have heard of a SWOT analysis, and generally that's what we would recommend. It's not always the right fit, and there are different types of tools you can go through, but in most cases we would suggest that the SWOT is the right solution. So a SWOT analysis is strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, and these are all interlinked with each other. Strengths and weaknesses are about you, they're internal, they're things you can control. Opportunities and threats are external, they're competing forces that are around you that you have to deal with. So you can fix weaknesses, you can only mitigate threats. And then similarly, obviously, strengths and opportunities are positive, weaknesses and threats are negative. So for example, a strength may be that you have a really strong workforce that is low turnover and high engagement and high productivity. A weakness may be that things are moving more and more online and you don't have good online capabilities. An opportunity might be that one of your competitors is going out of business and you could take advantage of that by trying to absorb their customers. A threat may be something like the coronavirus. So those are some examples. So we would go through a structured exercise with a client very early in the strategic planning process to try to determine all of the things that go into these 4 categories, and then work to leverage your strengths, correct your weaknesses, seize any opportunities, and mitigate any threats or risks. Once you have an idea of where you want to go and the circumstances in which you find yourself, then we start to talk about setting goals, and the real action-oriented part of these plans is in the goals area. And there's 4 kind of technical terms, and we might not necessarily recommend that you use these, because you also want to avoid, and we'll talk about that later, cynicism through things that seem too jargony. But this is what the textbook would refer to. You have your key result areas, which are like categories. So this might be revenue, customer satisfaction, those sorts of things. Then within each key result area, you would have goals. So you want to improve customer satisfaction, you want to increase revenue, and then you would have actions. And those are the things that you're going to do to cause those things to happen. When we talk about goals, they need to be SMART. And what SMART means, as you can see there in the first bullet, it's an acronym for specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. And why that's important is because if your goals aren't SMART, they're very difficult to obtain in an objective way. So you might have a goal that is specific and relevant, but it's totally unachievable, unmeasurable, and there's no specificity around the time it would take. So for example, maybe you want to grow your revenues by 50%. Well, 50% over what period of time? Is it realistic to grow your revenues by 50%? Is that ever going to be possible? You don't want to set yourself up to fail with unreasonable expectations. And is that relevant? If you're a not-for-profit, growing your revenue isn't a very good goal. So you want to make sure that each of your goals check those boxes. So maybe you have a goal that is, we want to grow revenue. Well, that's not measurable. We want to grow revenue by 20%. Is that achievable? Oh, well, maybe not. We want to grow revenue by 15%. Is that relevant? Yes, that's relevant. We're a for-profit enterprise. We want to grow revenue. That's a key driver that our shareholders are interested in. Okay, well, by when? Are you going to grow revenue by 15% over the next 20 years or the next 2 years? So then you end up with a SMART goal, which is we're going to grow revenue by 15% over the next 2 years. And that's an exercise you can go through with each of your goals to make sure that they're SMART. Then you want measurement criteria. Pretty easy to figure out how you're going to measure revenue growth. That's just X divided by Y. Other things, it's more complicated, but you always want to have a measurement because you want to be able to objectively say whether or not you've achieved your goals. So you need to be creative sometimes. If you want your customers to be more satisfied, you might need to introduce some kind of a customer survey tool so that you can measure it. Finally, obviously, you want to have some kind of an implementation plan. to make sure that the strategic plan will be put to good use. You don't just want it to collect dust on a shelf. So you want to look at your organizational design. Is your organization structured in such a way that it can deliver on this plan? Maybe you've put a big focus on online sales, and you don't have anybody that's their job. So you might want to create a new position to drive that, or redefine a position. So the organizational design kind of talks about what you need in order to achieve this from a human resource perspective primarily, but also from a business perspective in terms of your operations and your financials. Resource identification. So if you've got a nice design, well, do you have the right people? Do you need to hire? Do you need to retrain? Have you got budgets allocated appropriately to implement this plan? And then work planning cycles. A good strategic plan is the beginning of business planning. It's not the end. So best practices, all of your employees should have a work plan. Work plans shouldn't be complicated. A best practice we always recommend is a one-page work plan for each employee, maybe 2 pages if they have a very complex set of responsibilities. But all of your work plans in a good business planning cycle will tie back to the strategic plan. So if you're in sales, you're responsible for some of the action items that tie back to some of the sales goals. And you can measure people's performance and use that to help measure the company or the business organization enterprise's performance as well. Then finally is change management. Change management is very important. Change is hard. Generally, people don't like change. They may resist change. They may fear change. And you can avoid that. And also, we talked about the valley of despair earlier. The better job you do on change management, the shallower that valley is going to be. So you want to engage your workers and you want to engage your shareholders. You want to do that early in the process. The last thing you want to do is have some big all-staff meeting where you walk out and say, congratulations, we have this big new plan. We're completely revolutionizing how we do business, and everybody's job function is going to change tomorrow. That's not good. So you want to avoid surprises. You want to avoid cynicism. So you want to make sure people understand why you're doing it, that they understand why it is in their interest as well as the company's interest. It will make their job clearer. It will make it easier for them to understand what your expectations are of them as an employee, how they can be good performers by checking the boxes of what they're responsible for. Obviously, your shareholders are all going to need to be managed in a different way if you have a set of shareholders. And then finally, for your customers don't need to know that you have a strategic plan or what's in it as a general rule. Depending on what kind of business you are, that might not always be the case, but ordinarily that's the case. But there might be elements of it you want to communicate to them. So if part of your strategic plan is that you're going to change your business hours, you're going to move from an automated kind of computer voice answering system to a live caller answer, or vice versa, that you're going to have a new website with a totally new customer experience online. Again, don't surprise people. So you want to reach out to your customers in advance. You may want to do some advertising to talk about the new things that you're going to be doing. So those are things you want to consider as part of change management. So unless you have anything else to add there, Tim, that's the presentation, and we'd be happy to take people's questions.
I'm going to unmute my mic. Thank you very much. I've never heard anybody talk about the Valley of Despair, but that's a good one. So we have 25 people on the call. We'd be happy to invite people to unmute their mic and provide a question, or you can put something in the chat. Can you give us, I have one question. Can you give us an example of almost a follow through of how you would set a goal, like make one up and give us the sort of the SMART and the key results and how you could measure criteria, just to follow the flow of what a goal might look like?
Okay, so the first area is the KRA, the key result area. So that's kind of that might be one word or two words. It's just what part of your business are you talking about? So you might have a for-profit kind of sales-oriented enterprise might have customer satisfaction, revenue, sales, employee engagement. That might be the four KRAs. So if you look at sales, maybe you're shipping 1,000 units a month, and you want to increase that by 20% over the next 2 years. So let's look at increase that by 20% over the next 2 years. Is that smart? Is it specific? Yes. Is it measurable? Yes. It's a number. Numbers are easy to measure. Is it achievable? That's a conversation you have to have at that planning table. Can you grow 20% in a year? Is that realistic? Or should it be 10? Maybe sometimes you have stretch targets. So maybe you say we're going to try to grow sales by at least 10 and maybe 20 on the outside. But the last thing you want to do, particularly if you're new to this sort of thing, is get your employees all bought in, which is hard, and then they all fail. And then you'll never get them bought in again. So it's very achievable is a very, very important component. Is it relevant? Yes. If you're a sales enterprise, a sales goal is relevant, and time bound you get that year. So it's smart. So you'll look at action items. How are we going to do that? And you can brainstorm around that. Do you need more salespeople? Do your salespeople need better tools to do their job? Do you need to have a bigger push online? Do you need to tie it back to a different goal, which you might have a very close interaction between sales and customer satisfaction if you have a lot of repeat customers? So you might have several actions. So you're going to say, okay, we're going to have 2 salespeople. We're going to give them a new kind of tool, tablet-based tool, instead of working on a clipboard with a piece of paper. And we're going to have 14-day post-sale follow-up with customers to make sure they're happy. Maybe try to do some upselling and some repeat buying, for example.
If I could ask a follow-up, how often should you be revisiting those individual goals? And secondly, well, let's answer that one, and then I've got one more.
So those should be quite tied to the plan. So a good strategic plan would be 5 years, and it would have 5-year goals. So your sales growth target might be 10% by the end of year 1, 20% by the end of year 2, 40%, 80, 100, whatever. So you can have goals that span out over the course of the years, or a single goal that has yardstick measurement points along the length of the plan. Those theoretically shouldn't change. The thing that does change more regularly is the work plan. And depending on the complexity and the size of the organization, like if you're a great big, huge, multi-hundred employee organization, there'd be different layers of plans probably. You would have divisional plans. Maybe you get a VP of sales with 100 salespeople. They're going to have a distinct kind of business plan around the sales piece. But the work plans, which is where the rubber really hits the road, those should be usually annual. They might be biannual or quarterly. And so that's where you would say, okay, strategic plan, we've got 25 actions in it. Your employee X, you're responsible for 3 of those 25 action items in whole or in part. And here's the work we want you to do for the next 12 months to move those along.
So if that's the case, what if you don't make the first year goals? At what point do you decide, okay, if we didn't hit first year targets, then everything else sort of becomes much more difficult? At what point do you review, if it's a 5-year plan, how do you deal with that?
Yeah, well, that's why measurement is so important, because sometimes, and I'm using sales, which is not a very good example for this, because you're always going to know whether or not you're going to hit your sales targets or whether you've hit them, because that's very straightforward. Some of this stuff is much more subjective, and it's really important to find measures to turn the subjective and the qualitative to the objective and the quantitative. And I tell people not to use jargon. Here I go. So, I mean, you can reevaluate that, of course, and it's the same notion of the SCurve is a great example of that. If you were expecting to go like this and you've gone like this, then obviously you need to reevaluate. So that's one of the sections I said that you want to reevaluate your plan if things have changed. And one of the things that may have changed is the achievability of your goals. So if your goals were achievable, that shouldn't be a problem. unless there's been some huge circumstance change like coronavirus. And those are certainly always the sorts of checkpoints. If you can't achieve your goals, because why aren't you able to achieve them? Were they just unrealistic? That's a relatively easy fix. Or is there some environmental factor that's outside of your control, and you have to revisit everything? Or is there some environmental factor that's inside of your control and you can fix it?
I have another question too. We always have had a Chamber of Commerce strategic plan in place, as do most not-for-profits. But it seems that more and more businesses are getting a strategic plan. How do you see the strategic plan differing from their business plan, or do you see them as two adjoined documents, or how do you see that?
Yeah, they should be very much interconnected. Usually the strategic plan would be here and then the business plan would follow from it. So the business plan might be for 1 to 2 years as opposed to 3 to 5, and it might go into a little bit more operational detail. But those should be totally joined at the hip, those two plans for sure.
I think a lot of small businesses don't have that strategic plan piece. They've only got the business plan. So this is good information as to how to go about that. We have a question in our chat. It says from Bill Chong, thank you for your presentation. I view your curve for Valley of Despair and SCurve for business life cycle. Can you share the point to recognize the transit time in each period or the duration of time in each period of your curve?
Yeah, let me pull that back up. While I'm doing that, I'll just pick up on something you mentioned, Krista, which is, oops, that didn't work. 1 second. About small businesses. And a lot of small businesses, in my experience, don't really see where this sort of a planning tool is relevant to them. I think it's for a bigger enterprise. But I don't agree with that at all. A strategic plan doesn't need to be 20 or 30 or 50 pages long. It might be a dozen or maybe even a little less than that. And it can be very relevant to a very small business. One of the things that Tim and I were talking about when we were putting this kind of smaller version of the presentation together is, growth isn't necessarily a driver for all businesses, even businesses that are for profit. If you're a small mom and pop shop and you don't have any interest in hiring a bunch of people and managing a workforce, your goals might be to hold revenue steady or grow it by inflation, and that's fine. And you can develop strategies for that. I mean, what would make a convenience store profitable 25, 30 years ago versus today is very, very different. And so you do need to kind of relook at your strategy just because your environment's changing, even if you're not in a growth-oriented section of the economy, or if your particular circumstances aren't growth-oriented. To answer Bill's question, there's a reason why there's no units on this chart, and it's because it really depends. How significant is the change? And is one factor that you need to keep into account. But the goal here would be to make the depth of the valley as shallow as possible and the width of the valley as narrow as possible. And you can do that through good planning. So if you understand that you're going to have a new website that could have glitches, how you can minimize the size of this is to make sure that you put it through really, really aggressive testing. So before it launches, you've worked all or most of the bugs out. If you are going to change the roles and responsibilities of your employees, you might want to look at phasing that in over time or training them in advance. So maybe you take a quarter of your workforce out of the equation at a time for training, and then put them into their new roles, so that you don't have everybody trying to figure out a new way of doing business at the same time. There's all kinds of different tools you can use to mitigate the valley of despair. Very unusual to completely eliminate it, although that would be the goal. That's not a very, very smart goal because it's perhaps not achievable. But the notion there is you're going to have this downward tick. How do you get through it as quickly as possible, and how do you make the downward nature of it as shallow as possible? And you can give you a couple of examples of things you can do to try to mitigate that. On the S-curve, again, theoretically, this is probably 5 years. That's the idea is that if you wouldn't go any longer than 5 years, because you're probably not going to be able to sustain growth for any longer than that without readjusting your plan, because things will have changed both internally and externally. So you want these kind of flat portions of the curve to be as short as possible and the growth portion to be as long as possible. And if you're really successful, maybe you just stay on this part of the curve. New plan kicks in and you continue to go straight up. New plan kicks in, you continue to go straight up. That would be kind of the goal. But again, the purpose of planning is to make that curve as steep as possible, which means you're growing as fast as possible, and then to make those flat parts as short as possible, or to eliminate them altogether.
You mentioned something about businesses might not want like that kind of a steep growth trajectory, and they may have different ideas in mind for their strategic plan. I owned a small business for a number of years, and one of the things that we really focused on was profitability. We knew that in the space, the physical space that we were in, and with the complement of staff that we had, there was only so much capacity we had. So we thought, do we want to go through the process of moving or doing all those types of things? Or would our strategic plan, or we didn't call it that then, it was just a plan, would our plan really be more effective for us if we focused on becoming more efficient and becoming more profitable? So I guess we can look at that from different perspectives depending on the needs of the company.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There's more than one way to grow profit, and it's not always just growing revenue. It can drive down costs, can be a big part of the plan as well, for sure.
Mm-hmm. So we have another question in our chat. Michael Collicott says, I found many organizations that have strategic plans think of them only when it's time to renew it. How can an organization make more effective use of the strategic plan? For example, how do you manage it to inform the operational planning process?
So that's a great question, Michael. One of the things that you hear people talk about is dashboarding. So you take those measurements for those goals and you visualize them, and it can be real fancy with some piece of computer software, or it can be a chart in Excel that you print out on your printer and paste it in the lunchroom or in a busy thoroughfare of your workspace, so that people can see what's going on. You might even have quarterly or biannual employee meetings where you can show and celebrate success and talk about what we're going to do to work together to address the areas where there's less success. But the really, really biggest one is work planning. It's a lot of people that manage people that have never been trained in how to be managers. And a lot of them, if they have a performance review function, it's once a year, and it's, let's go over your performance for the last year. Let's take a look at your work plan that we haven't looked at since we met 12 months ago, and put it back in the file folder, and we'll see you again next May. That's not a functional performance management regime. You should always be talking about that. I mean, presumably you have check-ins with your employees on a semi-regular basis. Maybe it's weekly, maybe it's bi-weekly or monthly. Pull out the work plan. How are you doing? Is this working for you? Do you need help here? Are there barriers that you're finding it difficult to meet these goals? And those work plans should be tied to goals in the strategic plan. And that kind of an engagement with your employees on the one-on-one, but also even dashboarding, it makes it kind of part of their day-to-day job. And then all of a sudden, it's not some, roll your eyes, some management consultant come in with some crazy jibber jabber. Let's get this over and done with as quickly as possible. It becomes kind of how you plan your day, your week, your month, and how you do your work.
That does that answer the question? I'm going to put my speaker view on. Oh yes, Michael says thank you. So that's good. We don't have any other questions in the chat. Does anybody have an interest in unmuting their mic and asking a question? Or any more last comments or observations from Jordan or from Tim?
If there aren't any other questions, one thing I'll throw out there, I don't know entirely who everybody is from and what type of organizations they work for, but when I first became exposed to strategic planning, I was in a communications issues management kind of a role, and set aside the strategic plan, even the work plan. It seemed, how could you do a work plan? Because I can't tell you tomorrow or today what I'm going to be doing tomorrow. It's going to depend on what media call I get or what, you know, uh, a story I tell sometimes, which is kind of funny, is the day before Canada Day fell on a Tuesday. There were just a handful of us working on the Monday, and I picked the assignments for everyone. And I picked all the easy files where I wouldn't think there'd be any calls for myself because I'm a nice guy. And one of my files was agriculture, and a transport truck full of bees upset on the St. Leonard exit of the Trans-Canada. So I'd never had a busier media relations day in my life. I'm talking to the Toronto Star, I'm talking to Associated Press about this big bee escape. So how do you work plan if that's what your work cycle is like? It would probably be the same for lawyers and others who, have very transitory issues. And you can plan for that because you can plan for things like customer satisfaction and so forth, as opposed to output of widgets. So this is a tool that can really be adapted to any type of an organization, big, small, for profit, not for profit, with manufacturing, which is very predictable, or service oriented, which can be less predictable.
Yeah, there's so many variables that can pop up in the run of a day or at any time during a plan that can change the plan and just change your direction. But I guess the important thing is to stay on target and not let it throw you off your plan. When you deal with that issue, get back on and refresh and make sure that you're headed in the right direction again. The up trajectory would be the direction we all want to be in. Well, I really appreciate you bringing this to us today. I think it's something for a lot of businesses to think about, the fact that they actually need a strategic plan. They need to sort of have the vision, the goals, the direction, and setting their own mission, their values, and their vision for the company is something that's really important, because if you don't know where you want to go, how will you ever be able to get there? So thank you, Jordan. Thank you, Tim. We have recorded this session, so we'll be posting it for anyone who wants to perhaps share it with some of your team when you're talking about implementing a strategic plan in your business. And also we'll be sharing it on our social media for others who weren't able to join us today. So thanks very much. And thanks everybody for attending, and we will see you at an upcoming webinar. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Krista. Thanks, everyone.